The world before the flood can be represented like this. We have a pristine world of beauty with a great sea, a great ocean, and seas fingering into the landmass. And that world was surrounded by a firmament canopy. That canopy of water was approximately 11 miles above the earth. Now, that firmament canopy of water did a wonderful thing. It filtered out the shortwave radiation from the sun and from stellar bodies. But the long wave and mid-spectral radiation would come right on in. That did something wonderful. The world before the flood had greater atmospheric pressure because of the gravitational weight of that firmament pushing in on the atmosphere. The world before the flood was protected from the harmful radiation. And that produced some very wonderful things. Essentially, everything in the fossil record was larger in the past than it is today. The great white shark today gets 36 feet long, but in the fossil record, he is 60 feet long. Something must explain that. In addition to that, this lepidodendron has its counterpart today. The very same form is the lycopsid club moss. It gets 16 inches tall at best. But in the fossil record, that very same plant is 150 feet tall. We're not evolving. We've lost something in the process, or lost the conditions that would permit the full expression of the life form. Did you get that? We are building a context at Glen Rose for the first time in history called the hyperbaric biosphere. And in that biosphere, we're going to be having 2.18 atmospheres of pressure. That's what the best of our research shows. That canopy, firmament, pushing in on the atmosphere would have introduced 2.18 atmospheres of pressure. We're going to introduce 25% oxygen, 0.25% CO2, carbon dioxide. That should make a world of difference, because that's what academically we find indicated in the fossil record. What will that do? Well, we have dragonflies today. Here in East Texas, the dragonflies get how big? About a 4-inch wingspan, maybe 5 inches. In the fossil record, that very same life form, the dragonfly, had a 36-inch wingspan. What explains that? The evolutionary concept cannot really explain that, because if the processes with increased energy, which I'll address in the next lecture, with increased complexity, is causing the forms to accelerate in complexity, they certainly should accelerate in dexterity and size. Well, that's not the case. We find they were bigger in the past. Human life forms were larger in the past, and incidentally, they were more intelligent in the past. But given these circumstances, with a little over 2 atmospheres of pressure, 25% oxygen in contrast to today's 21% oxygen, the brain, from conception on, would be hyperoxygenated. Not to the point of toxicity. This is the perfect level, a little over 2 atmospheres of pressure, 25% oxygen. In the fetal formation of the brain, it would be enlarged to begin with. The cellular structure would be fed and nurtured from before the child was born. Then you would live in a context where your brain would be totally fed in all its capacity with oxygen. That means that every person sitting in this audience, if you were to live under these conditions and having been born under those conditions, would put Albert Einstein to shame in your intellectual capacity. You have that capacity. Why don't you use it? Well, we really can't. to our fullest capacity. But if our brains, if the blood plasma were hyperoxygenated today, that would solve a lot of problems. Oh, that does solve a lot of problems, including the dinosaurs. You see, with their small lung capacity, the hemoglobin cell can only take 4 oxygen molecules. Did you know that? The hemoglobin in the blood is saturated with 4 oxygen molecules. That's all it can take. And you can't get enough oxygen to the deep cell tissue of such bulk size. But Texas A&M University has found that under 2 atmospheres of pressure with slightly enriched oxygen, all the blood plasma becomes saturated with oxygen. That means that overnight, an open wound heals. Today it takes 14 days for that open wound to heal. But overnight, under those hyperoxygenated contexts, an open wound heals. Now let's take it further. I think probably the best illustration of what it was like before the flood, or what it was like to recuperate before the flood, is found in the experience of a little girl, probably the most famous little girl in the world. Does anyone here recognize the name Jessica McClure? How many recognize the name Jessica McClure? Every hand in the building as far as I can see. Who's that little girl? She's a little girl who fell in a well, Midland, Texas. 58.5 hours, her right leg was suspended behind her back. And for 58.5 hours, her right foot was in her face. That's a pretty difficult position to be in. She's a brave little girl. I'm not sure I could have held out that long. When they got to her, her right foot, because of its suspension and the lack of blood supply and oxygen, her right foot was black. And they were sure they were going to have to amputate her foot. You know what they did for that little girl? They rushed her to the Midland Hospital, rushed her to a hyperbaric medical chamber. They put her under 2+ atmospheres of pressure, and they gave her 100% oxygen because they needed a quick fix. Now, she couldn't live under 100% oxygen for long periods of time, but they certainly needed it quickly. So they essentially put her in a context like pre-flood man had. What happened to her right foot? In a few hours, it turned pink. And then her toes began to turn pink. They thought at first they'd lose the entire foot. Then they thought, well, we're not going to lose the foot, we'll lose all her toes. Then her big toe turned pink. Second, third, fourth. They finally lost the little pinky because it wouldn't turn pink. Well, what I'm doing is introducing an overview of the creation model. It appears that her body was designed to function and repair itself under those circumstances. Well, if that's so, her body had to be designed. And if that's so, her long-lost predecessors lived under such a context. Well, that's the creation model. With a firmament canopy of water suspended above the earth, the furnace was in the floor, but not only would that have tremendous effects physiologically for animals, it would have tremendous effects for vegetation. And that effect would be as follows. It has been found that if you increase carbon dioxide and increase pressure, the plants grow tremendously. In fact, it has been found by experimentation of a Japanese physicist, Dr. Kiyomori, Keio University, Tokyo, Japan, who had a problem. Dr. Kiyomori lived in his house, but his office was in the basement. There's Dr. Mori behind his desk. You'd recognize him anywhere, wouldn't you? Hope the cameras get a close-up. That's Dr. Mori, believe it or not. But he has a problem. He doesn't have enough light in his basement, and he doesn't want to pay for any more electricity. That's always a problem. But Dr. Mori had an ingenious idea. He knew what fiber optics would do, and he had some fiber optic cable at the university. So he brought some home, with or without permission, I don't know. He brought some home and he ran it out the roof. Ran it through the rafters, down the walls, and into the basement. And sure enough, it worked. You know how fiber optic cables work. You can tie them in a knot, shine a light in one end, and the light will just follow all the way through the knot and come out the other end. Well, that's what happened here. So it worked. Light from the sun struck the cable, came right on down, and came out the bottom into his basement. Beautiful. What he forgot was that the dimension of the fiber optic cable that he had filtered out the ultraviolet spectrum of light. Now that's important. It's the ultraviolet that's giving us most of the trouble we have today. In the next lecture, you'll see how it's destroying us. It's the ultraviolet that is a major problem. All right? That fiber optic cable filtered out the ultraviolet so that the light he got in his basement was essentially like the light we got before the flood, because water also filters out ultraviolet and shortwave radiation. Did you get that? The light that he got was like the light we had before the flood. So, Dr. Mori, being Japanese, wanted to plant something living. And he put a little tomato plant, just a natural tomato plant, in his basement. In a few weeks, the thing grew out of control. He knew he had something. So he went outside, built a platform, shielded that platform from ultraviolet radiation with a shielding process, plastic shielding process, put his tomato plant there, but he did something else. He knew that tomato plant, if it was going to grow that fast, needed a lot more carbon dioxide. Indications are in the fossil record that we had a lot more carbon dioxide than we had in the past. So he increased the carbon dioxide and pressure at the base of his plant. Guess what happened to his plant, his tomato plant? It grew. How well did it grow? Now remember, what he's doing is actually simulating primitively what it was like before the flood. What about those ages in the biblical record? Are they literal? Well, let's see if it'll do that for tomato plants. It ought to do that for us under those circumstances, shouldn't it? How old do you think would be a good age to live and still be in control and in command of your faculties? 80? Multiply 80 by 12. What do you get? 960. That has a 12-fold lifespan. Multiply your 80 by 12 and you get 960 years. That means that in certainly academic theory, the capability under those circumstances is for some of your ancestors to have lived 960 years. Did they? Sure they did. Methuselah lived older than that. Adam almost lived that long. But now it's better still. Let me wind up this introductory concept. This is just an overview. We've only introduced the concept. One of the nation's leading scholars is Dr. Edward Blick, University of Oklahoma, head of Aerospace Engineering Department. Dr. Edward Blick has stated in print that under these circumstances, with the firmament canopy filtering out the ultraviolet radiation, and under these circumstances, with the added pressure introduced by the gravitational weight of that firmament pushing in on the atmosphere, under those circumstances, with man's large lung capacity, man could run up to 200 miles without fatigue. How many would like to be able to run 200 miles without fatigue? Sure. How many would like to be able to run 200 miles? Well, how many would like to be able to run at all? Under those circumstances, it was absolutely utopian. But I've only touched the hem of the garment. It's much better still. Stay tuned. After a short break, we'll come back to the next lecture.
Now, this says maybe a lack of oxygen killed the dinosaurs. A lack of oxygen. Well, they had a big symposium in 1993. A bunch of scientists got together to study the Apatosaurus. And they said, folks, we've got a problem. An 80-foot Apatosaurus had nostrils the same size as a horse. How is an 80-foot animal going to get enough air through nostrils the same size as a horse? Well, apparently they did breathe, because bones of dinosaurs are found all over the planet. Even in Antarctica and Alaska. I mean, dinosaurs lived everywhere, okay? So how could an 80-foot animal get enough air? Well, today he probably couldn't. Not to get 80 feet long. You know, when they drill into the amber, how many saw the movie Jurassic Park, you know, where they drilled in to get the mosquito blood out? Sometimes in amber, which is petrified tree sap, they find air bubbles in the amber. When they analyze the air bubbles, they find out they're 50% more oxygen than we have today. Today we're breathing 21% oxygen. Amber bubbles have 32% oxygen. Did you know if you lived in a world with double the air pressure and 50% more oxygen, just breathing would be exciting? If you double the air pressure and increase oxygen, not only does your hemoglobin take on oxygen like it's supposed to, plasma will get oxygen saturated, which means you could run hundreds of miles without getting tired. I think things were a whole lot different. In the pre-flood world, if they had to double the air pressure and increased oxygen, you would just be full of energy all the time. There's a guy in Japan started raising tomato plants with pressurized carbon dioxide. You know, plants breathe CO2 and not oxygen. His tomato plant grew faster than normal. When it was 2 years old, it was 16 feet tall and produced 900 tomatoes. They moved it to a shopping center and built scaffolding to hold the branches up. They said, you know, this thing might produce 10,000 tomatoes. This is one tomato plant. It ended up growing 40 feet tall and producing 15,000 tomatoes off one plant. It was a cherry tomato plant, but tomatoes were coming off baseball size off of his. But I debated Jeannie Scott in a debate, and she said, Dr. Hovind, there are 80 separate layers of coal in the Midwest. She's right. She said, if you look at the amount of coal in the world today, the entire biomass, all the plants of the world today, could not possibly be converted to that much fossil fuel. She's right again. There is so much coal in the world that if you took every tree and blade of grass and bush and squished it, you couldn't make all the coal. There are enormous volumes of coal in the earth. I said, Jeannie, you are right. She said, well, don't you see, Hovind, there had to be an enormous amount of time to lay down all the coal seams. Oh, no. Right there, she's wrong. You see, she's looking at today's world and assuming that's how it's always been. The coal we find in the ground today is a result of that flood, which buried the world before the flood, when they had lots more trees. There's a coal mine in Montana that is 10,000 square miles of coal up to 200 feet thick. Someone told me a few months ago they've now found a seam 300 feet thick. That's a lot of coal. A lot of coal. And sometimes in coal, human artifacts are found. This bell was found inside a lump of coal. This iron pot was found inside a lump of coal. The sole of a shoe found inside a lump of coal. But the Bible says there were herbs, that's plants, over all the earth. It's not that way today. 70% of the earth is underwater. The earth was covered with plants when God made it. Did you know they find leaves in Antarctica? The Bible says before the flood came, they lived to be over 900 years old and probably didn't wrinkle.